Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Salutations.
All right, there we go. That's your intro for the day.
That's my salutation.
Thanks you guys for being here as we, still cope with the absence of Rachel. She is officially gone.
I think she's very happy, though, to be gone, knowing what we're talking about today.
Oh, yeah. She's going back to Arkansas.
Yeah, I saw her in a meeting yesterday because this is like her official last week. Mm-hmm. And she's like, you guys are talking about that? She saw my Instagram and she was like, I think a little bit like jealous, but also like, thank goodness I got out of there.
Okay. I'm going to just believe the other. I'm going to believe that she's really sad that she's not here to talk about gun control, which is a topic that we're going to be discussing later. But first, we have to ease into these things,
Yes.
we have to lighten the mood a little bit.
You can tell us a joke.
And no, I don't have any jokes to tell you. I don't. I'm just looking at the notes prepared for this episode, and it says, intro banter. Someone pasted, what is the craziest place you've lost your cell phone?
That was me. I pasted it.
And
is that because you already have an answer?
I do have an answer.
See, this is like that silver boot from like a month ago.
He's setting himself up for the banter.
First of all, I copied and pasted this like 2 days ago, and you
I saw it.
The same amount of access to this document as me. So,
all right,
I'm prepared.
Who's going first?
Jess.
Okay, so
craziest place you have lost your cell phone.
I read this question. I had to work from home yesterday, and I read it out loud, and I was like, I can't think. And my kids automatically reminded me. Well, first I want to say that I lose my cell phone on a regular basis. Like every time I've been pregnant, there's just like a period of time where you lose anything that means anything to you. Children, keys, phones.
Sounds bad.
It's the most frustrating thing. So I got triggered a little bit by the question, but then I realized this recently happened to me the last time that big snowstorm we had a couple months ago.
Oh, yeah.
I was shoveling in a hoodie and my phone plopped out of somewhere in the snowbank. We have a 3-lane driveway, so it's pretty big. And I couldn't find that darn thing. And it took me probably an hour. It just like flopped out into a snowbank. Everything's white.
You found it?
Finally.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I was like to the point of like the 3 kids were out. Nap time was coming. Like, why am I crying over a cell phone? And also like screaming at my kids to stop shoveling snow because God knows it could be under there.
Yeah.
But I finally found it.
Wow.
Good thing you were shoveling, though.
Took
and you
me a
weren't,
long time.
You weren't snow blowing because it could have got caught up in there. And I've seen that happen to people. So it's dangerous out there. Snow blowing.
And everything's
phone.
white. I mean, you can't find it. That just like falls right in.
Well, we're glad you found it.
Yeah.
I found it.
Really
All right,
happy
I gotta
for you.
come back down.
Yeah, for me, it's just weird. I mean, we're living in an AirTag now world, which those came out last week. And so I lose my keys a lot, my phone not as much because I've got an Apple Watch, and it was one of the best inventions ever when you can just ding the thing and it'll help you find it. Like you can pull up something if you don't have an Apple Watch and push a little notification button.
They're pulling out their Apple Watches. I've got my Fitbit.
By the way, I don't think he always listens, so I'm going to call this out. Yesterday, I was in our staff development with our lead minister sitting right next to him. And Jed was going through Hebrews 13 with our staff, and Mark didn't have the notifications on his watch off. So he, like, when people were texting him, and so he would get a little ding. It wasn't super loud. So then he wanted to silence it. So he, picked up his watch to silence his notifications. And I watched him hit that button instead on accident. I panic because he's like, oh, I hit the wrong button because it did the ding thing, you know? And then he's like, ding! And then he did it again. He did it twice in a row. And then I could just it was one of those moments where you're watching someone that made like a mistake and are kind of embarrassed.
And you're trying to keep it together.
And that's definitely happened to him before.
It's the iconography of it all, though, because like the ping is like a phone with sound coming out of the sides of it, where the mute is a bell with a line through it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you know that, but they should just put the bell with a line through it before, because you're just scrolling through thinking, okay, it's this phone sound button.
So
no.
that's a side note.
I've done that before myself.
Yeah. Of yesterday at staff development, and so it was kind of funny to me, mainly because that stuff happens, like you're preaching and a phone goes off or whatnot, and it's the best when like the person has no clue. Anyway, it's not the best, but it's just funny. But I digress. The craziest place I have ever lost it was before even Find My iPhone and all that kind of stuff was on a golf course. And so we could not find it. And I was panicked like Jess was. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is my phone. Call it. You're like on a golf course. No, you're not going to hear it. I don't ever have my phone on anything besides silent mode. Like literally, I never take it off of that, especially now that I can do the ding thing. Anyway, we have to think of a new name, but
it's called Ping.
Ping.
Yeah, you
ping my phone. Okay.
Yeah.
So we are just driving everywhere around the golf course. My friends are trying to call it, it's like, zzz, zzz, but you don't hear that on a golf course. All you hear is birds chirping. And so, and we stopped in our round because I was in such a panic over like losing my phone and is someone going to turn it in? So you backtrack all your steps and then eventually we found it.
Where was it?
It was like right next to the sand trap where I hit my ball on the 5th hole. And so every time I go there, I remember that moment I lost my phone. I'm thankful for the ping, and I'm thankful for Find My Friends, because I've lost it, since, but like I can log in on my wife's phone or whatever, and then you can make the ping happen. But for me, my detriment is the fact that literally my phone is always on silent mode.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to find it. And so it's not that crazy, but it was one of those moments where it's definitely panic and golf and all that.
The lost phone panic.
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
Never lost my phone. All right, coming up next, we have headlines. Okay, our first headline comes from WashingtonPost.com. It says, after violently arresting a woman, 73, with dementia, police laughed about it. Video shows them saying, "We crushed it." Has everyone here watched the video of her being arrested?
Yes.
I have.
It's really heartbreaking. It's upsetting.
It's hard to watch.
It's incredibly hard to watch. It's disgusting in a lot of ways. But here's another example of, I don't want to just get on a soapbox here and we'll talk about a broken system or something like that. But I do think that these are examples of, hey, there seems to be a mantra with a lot of police enforcement that are just kind of go for the most aggressive tactic that you can. And then when you see this woman who is obviously not in the right state of mind get thrown to the ground, handcuffed, they dislocate her shoulder, they break her arm, and then you, after the fact, see them huddled around a computer watching the body cam footage and kind of like giggling about it and go, "Oh, there's did you hear the pop? Yeah, I think that was her shoulder." Oh, and kind of high-fiving each other. It's horrifying, and I don't know. I feel for this lady. I as far as what I've seen come of this since then, is it sounds like she is pressing charges. But it's just one thing after another. We keep seeing this, but this was probably one of the most grotesque examples of just this lady. It didn't seem like the punishment was matching the crime at all in this scenario.
Yeah, from what I read, because I hadn't heard about it until we put it in here yet, but I think the backstory is this lady took something from Walmart, like $13 worth of stuff, and she has dementia, and so she was walking away. So something happened to trigger this, and then she's walking down the highway. They call the police. Walmart does. They find this lady. You can tell, or at least I can, because because I've dealt with enough people with dementia or other mental health issues, that something is not, fully right inside of that. Or maybe even you assume she's drunk or whatever it might be, but something, she's not in the right state of mind, a normal state of mind. And so the police go after her, and you see that. And I mean, I will say I try to be pretty fair because I know most police that I know and even encounters I have had, I still always give grace and think the vast majority are good people.
Right.
And there's we've talked about bad pastors and any kind of profession. We could pile on and use really bad examples and find plenty of them to totally overrun an entire system or an entire, person. And so I think all of us who are fair would say there's brokenness in every kind of system. And when people have leadership and it gets to our heads, then there's times that and I've even done it, there's times where leadership gets to my head and I will use it in a way that's not good. But that being said, this was terrible. Like I was picturing, I've got an older gentleman who's a friend of mine who has some mental health problems. And I was just picturing him, and I could very much picture him in this kind of scenario. And just watching that was disgusting. It was heartbreaking. And then like it's the insult to the injury of watching them watch it back and not even like, oh yeah, maybe I was too harsh there, or oh wow, I didn't realize maybe she had an issue, but it was like piling on, like celebrating what they had done, and then she didn't get medical care for like 6 hours, and so it's one of those where I'm like, yeah, I hope that these people, pay for the crime, because I think it is a crime that they committed, and I hope others learn as well from this. And I think some things that you can learn from things like this are either to not do it or to get better at hiding it. And my hope is that you don't get better at hiding it, you learn to not do it, because I've also seen people get busted for things, even like I said, in ministry, and then you just become a better hider of your flaws. And so that wouldn't be the hope, but that people actually see this, their hearts break, and they work more to fix it.
I think if you have empathy at all, like my heart broke for this woman, like a $13 item. Okay, so we can sit there and say like she shoplifted, but the amount of force does not match like what she was obviously displaying. I mean, I think that was just so excessive. And then, like you said, to add insult to injury, I mean, I think all of us can picture like our grandma in that situation or somebody that we know. So, but then to add on to it, it wasn't just one person watching it back, like multiple people. And it was just like, where's the accountability? Like, where's the person that's going to stand up? And that's a scary thing in a situation like that, also to stand up and be that person.
Well, I want to call it almost like the good old boys club, but even there was a female officer who came to help him in that moment. And, you don't even see, and I'm sure there's weird, maybe tensions in that, where even if she did feel like it was obsessive or too much force, that she maybe felt like, well, they're not going to respect me if I say something. And maybe that's what happens in those types of cliques that form. But when we talk about a broken system, I think there is an overall systemic behavior that you see from certain police officers that I think is kind of an attitude of like the good old boys club, like you're the man, we're whatever. And like you said, Alex, it would be ignorant to just say this is everywhere. This is every police officer. But I think there is a large pocket of it throughout the country where you see this sort of mentality. And I don't think we have the answers of how this stuff can be worked out, but I do think there's further training that can happen. But just like you said, Jess, like where is the empathy in this? Where is it just because you're almost trained to just think of everyone as a criminal, everyone in their worst state? You just think like, okay, you made a crime. Obviously you're a terrible person. I have to think about you that way to do my job. Is that maybe where some of that comes from, or I don't know. It
made me think though. I read an article a couple weeks ago. I'd have to pull it up, but Omaha Police Department is going through extra mental health training for on the job so that they can better assess when they're encountering. I mean, you don't know who you're going to meet on a call. And that to me gave me encouragement. And I thought of it when I read this in the hopes of like, I hope that we don't read about this type of thing happening in Omaha, just because I know that they're putting extra effort into the mental health side of things and just training the officers better. So
yeah. It's something sad, but hopefully, and I one final note on this is I think as this stuff happens, the more and more that the bad cops come to the surface, or even when we saw the trial with the police officer involved with the murder of George Floyd recently and all that stuff, I think there's the thing to remember is when the bad stuff comes to the surface, this is something that's good for everyone. This is good for other policemen. This is good for society. It's a good reminder that, hey, we're not on different levels. Like we're the police and us as civilians, we're all on the same level here. And if they do something bad or wrong, then the punishment should fit, the crime in that scenario as well. And I think that should be comforting to people and not be as divisive as it has been. All right, our next headline comes from AP News. It says Supreme Court to take up right to carry gun for self-defense. I believe this is concerning, Alex, you kind of brought this one to our attention. I think this was concerning a law. Was it specifically from New York?
Yeah, it's a law in New York and other places have had it, but essentially they're going to be hearing a few different things. Magazine, how many you can carry, how much ammunition a magazine should be able to hold and things like that. But this is more specifically the right to publicly carry, a gun on a broader national level, like outside. And so I think they're trying to figure out, because there's different states that have, even inside of different states have different jurisdiction over who can carry. Are there open carry laws? For instance, I know Nebraska, there's an open carry law in Nebraska, but in Omaha, you can't open carry.
Right.
And so different cities have, some people in states would say they've overreached by, having a city law that overreaches a state law. So you get in so much complexities. And so that's where some of these conversations with the Supreme Court are happening and saying, should this be a sweeping law from state to state, or should this be a law that we do continue to leave up to different, places to have restrictive gun control and laws by city and all those kinds of things? And so they're going to be hearing, this over the next, few weeks, having arguments over it. And that's my understanding so far of it.
So the outcome of this could potentially be open carry would be legal at a federal level?
I don't know 100% what that full outcome will be. I don't know fully the arguments because I haven't sat down and read them, but I know there's states like New York. That's one of 8 states, with California, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. Yeah, that all do have a little tighter, that have put in restrictions on people's ability to open carry at a state level.
It will be interesting to see how some of this plays out too, with this being seems like one of the bigger gun conversations, or at least cases, since Justice Amy Coney Barrett has been in place, which is kind of makes the judges pretty conservative across the board, or at least majority. So, I don't. It's one of those things where it just feels too early to really say one way or another.
And I'll be honest, the news article didn't do the best job of actually explaining what they're arguing. All they say is that it's a case for the right to carry a firearm in public for self-defense. So how that plays out, I don't fully even understand, or what led to that, or what the decision that they're arguing began with. So,
and the arguments aren't happening for a while, right?
Yeah, it's not until this fall.
Yeah,
October.
Yep. So I guess that's something to keep our ears open for. But that does lead into our discussion topic this week, which is gun control. We figured we would pick one of the most divisive topics we could think of to chat about today. But, we have a pretty good track record of landing these things pretty civilly, and hopefully, if nothing else, again, we can just exemplify what it's like to have a conversation about this stuff. Let's start out as far as guns. I mean, there's a lot of emotion there. There's a lot of emotional reactions, and some of that can be because of the way you were raised. Did everyone around this table grow up around guns in their house? What were some of your experiences?
Jess is looking at me. Yes. So for me, actually, my experiences with guns grew up originally having guns in the house. And then I remember actually like a lot of fear around it when I was probably 5 or something. One of my earliest memories is we were out of town. We came home and someone had broken our house, done all this stuff, robbed my dad's guns. And I just remember like always fearing, oh, this person knows where we live now. They got into our house. They have got my dad's guns. What's going to happen with it? All that kind of stuff. And then we didn't have guns in the house after that point because they got stolen and my dad never recovered them. And then fast forward, growing up a little, and my grandpa did. He was in the military, shotguns, hunting, all that kind of stuff. My dad's dad. And then moving to Omaha when I was a first grader, didn't have them in the house that I knew of growing up, not a handgun, any of that. But then as my grandpa got older, he gave my dad some shotguns. But I would go hunting, with my dad, pheasant hunting every year, Sutton, Nebraska. We would go there. And then I got my little Red Ryder BB gun. I remember like getting that and thinking that was super fun, going out in the backyard. And so that was my experience. Then I remember my grandpa, I think he had to be 12 to take hunter's safety course, or maybe to hunt after 12. Either way, I remember going to hunter safety course with my grandpa, learning all about guns and the safety of it and all that kind of stuff. So grew up with it being in the backdrop, but not like, not a collection type of family, more heirlooms, more specifically for hunting, not even talking about it for self-defense types of stuff. Not really for sport even. I guess sport / hunting because we didn't eat all the pheasant, but
You didn't?
not all of it. I mean, so that's the Alex Ely household
My mom
background.
had this really good recipe for pheasant that involved cream of mushroom soup, and you baked it, and it was really good. That's the last time I remember.
Next week on our cooking show,
eating pheasant. Jess, your experiences growing up?
Yeah, I grew up. Both my parents are from Iowa. I feel like both sides of their family are like farmers, good old boys, and so I grew up. I can't remember when I didn't, just being around like times of like people going hunting. I used to go hunting with them, and they still do, but like deer hunting and pheasant. And so I feel like I grew up with the knowledge, or like myself as a person in relation to guns. And so I always had knowledge of them. But also my family was big on safety. And so I had taken a hunter safety course when I was younger too. And I just grew up with this knowledge of the power that they hold and what they're used for and what to do if I saw one. Like I felt like I grew up with that. And so my experiences based on how I was raised, I always felt comfortable with the thought. There was a time where I wasn't, where I didn't understand, because could be a scary thing to people. I don't have anything to base that on from personal experience, but it was just something that I grew up, I guess, in relation to and had knowledge of.
Yeah.
Felt comfortable with.
Yeah, I didn't grow up hunting or any of those things. I know I had family members that did. My dad always owned a variety of guns, whether it was shotguns or some pistols or handguns. I think a part of me was always conflicted because growing up in the 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of media was very anti-gun. Like I remember watching MacGyver. I don't know if anyone is a MacGyver fan, but his message was very anti-gun, and I remember taking a lot of that to heart as a kid. I remember one episode where he used a gun because someone had it. I don't know if he took it from the bad guy or whatever, but he took the gun and he used it as a wrench to loosen a bolt so he could make one of his MacGyver contraptions. And it was like their way of saying, "Oh, I don't use guns for violence, but whatever." So I think a lot of that media kind of played into my worldview of guns and why they were bad and whatever. But I do, on the other side, have memories of, I remember my dad always kept his big, like, I don't know what it was probably like a 357 or something like that in the seat of his van. And I think I mentioned before on the podcast this one trip where we went to Vegas, and I was a kid and I was like very influenced by how scary that town was in the early 90s. And I remember this guy approached our van, and I don't even remember the scenario. I don't know who he was. I don't know really what I think he was asking for money or something like that. But I remember being in the back seat behind my dad and kind of looking through the door and where his seat was, and he had his left arm kind of resting up on the window, out the window, while he's talking to this guy, and he had the Magnum pointed at the door, like below him, with his other hand while he's talking to this guy. And it was just one of those things, like I vividly remember that. And it was like this, nothing happened. We moved on, and that was the end of it. But it was just one of those things where I remember specifically as a kid feeling not scared, but incredibly safe in that moment. And I don't, but yet the idea of handling a gun or anything like that really scared me because I never had. So that's kind of, I guess I feel like I always kind of had combating forces as I was growing up and my emotions and feelings around guns in general.
Yeah. I remember moving to Omaha from, Scottsbluff, totally different worlds, both different sides of the state. And even growing up in rural Nebraska and then moving to Omaha, and now it's kind of funny to think Omaha's a big city, but like you hear of gangs and violence. And I remember hearing words like Crips and Bloods.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And like having a lot of fear around bad guys with guns.
Yeah.
And so that was a totally different, conflicting thing for me as I was moving to Omaha, because you didn't really hear of bad guys with guns in Scottsbluff. I mean, there were, obviously, anywhere, but moving to Omaha, I started to have that more fear factor of bad people that had guns, and then compound that with someone came into our house, stole my dad's guns. That's how they get bad guys get guns, is they rob people's houses. And so I do remember having that imagery growing up, and even moving to Omaha with this fear more of potential gun violence in life.
I agree. My growing up in relationship with guns I was not associating guns with gun violence. It was more guns with hunting or guns with sport, like skeet shooting.
Yeah.
Versus what you're talking about is moving and associating it with gun violence.
And so I do think that familiarity with guns, it definitely plays a part in how people feel about them as they get older and what that looks like. I think we've all kind of expressed that. But when you hear the phrases gun control or gun reform, does anything stand out to you about those phrases? Does one sound worse than the other, depending on your perspective? Does one sound better than the other?
I feel blessed that I have friends and family on different sides of this issue. So I feel like that helps give me insight, and it helps me be a little open-minded when I'm hearing the different sides of this. So to me, by association, I feel like a lot of people would say that gun control is the same as gun reform, and gun control is part of gun reform. And it's hard to separate the two when you feel like your Second Amendment rights are being infringed on in some way, rights that you've been given. But I also see the other side of like, of gun reform is I think a lot of people want safety. They see an issue in our country. They see an issue in the media every day. And so I think that when I see this gun reform, I see it in the people that I love, that I'm close to, and those are people that care about lives, and they care about, it's more in the gun violence of, okay, there's a problem, this is how we're going to fix it. And so I don't know how, but I can see both sides almost equally of, I see your side and I see your side. And it's like, are either of them wrong? I'm not going to settle and say like one is 100% wrong, one is 100% right. Cause I think that both sides have this validity. But for me, I see gun control as almost part of the reform. It's hard for me to separate the two if there is a difference. And I haven't seen, I don't know, enough arguments, I guess, separating the two. So it's easier for me when I'm looking at the whole thing to kind of put them closely together. But I think that word control it's a trigger word. It's a trigger word, not just in this conversation, but I mean, we could probably name 10 conversations where someone uses the word control and I instantly I'm frozen. I'm not okay with this. This is somebody subverting themselves over me in some way. Yeah. And so it's not one of those like, hey, let's have a conversation and come to an agreement word. So
I think
that's where I'm at.
Honestly, this has been the most stressful, time-consuming podcast, and we've done 80 something of these that I've been preparing for, and not even purposely. Like I just sometimes before these, I'll put something on my social media, just asking for thoughts and surveys and all that kind of stuff. And for me, one of my first questions was just knowing we're going to talk about gun control and hearing, out of my friends or followers who supports gun control. Is gun control even a part of a solution that could help curb gun violence? And so that was one of the first questions that I put out there. Because for me, as I hear that word gun control, I think back to my life, and I think, being in elementary school and remembering Columbine. And Columbine was a national shaking event. There was nothing like it, before that had so much press, that had so much, it was one of the first school shootings, and now it's become so normal that my kids have to do active shooter drills as they're in school. That was not a part of my reality. And so for me, as I've grown up and then I hear words like gun control, to me it wasn't automatically going to, they're coming for my guns. And cards on the table, I have a handgun. I own a gun, it's in my house, and so I'll just throw that out there. So as a gun owner, that hasn't been when I've heard that word, but as I was putting it on my social media and asking people, a lot of my friends who I know and trust and are professionals and wise and follow Jesus really were seeming to take issue with that word gun control. So I'm like, what's the disconnect for me and them in that issue of gun control? Because I see that progress, even an active shooter drill, I think is some kind of response to gun violence, inside, and we're seeing it more and more. It's becoming a more normative thing. And we're partly why we're seeing it more and more, and it's become more normative is social media. I think people that are able to get more notoriety. There's so many factors that go into it. We don't have time to get into that. So then I started to dig into the differences between these, because I'm like, I asked people after that, so how do we fix this problem? And a lot of them were giving me ideas that seemed like they would fit into what my thought of gun control was, but then it seemed like as I changed the wording to gun reform, then there was not as much hesitation or hate towards that. And then I obviously had friends that were in favor of gun control. So for me, it was just like, I was trying to honestly understand, and I'm so grateful for a lot of friends that inboxed me and gave me thoughts and too many articles to read, medical doctors, theological doctors, like all of it. And it left me in this place of realizing, man, I knew this was a divisive thing, but it's even more divisive than I realized. Yeah. And and the words have been hijacked so much that it almost seems like if you an issue like this, if you disagree with somebody, it marks if you're a good person or a bad person,
right?
Like that we can't separate those few things. And so for me, as I've been wading through this and listening, I was reminded of Proverbs 18:2. A fool finds no pleasure in understanding, but delights in airing their own opinions. Mm-hmm. And man, for this topic, and that convicts me a lot in my life, that verse, because I do oftentimes delight in airing my own opinions and not in understanding. But it's a great reminder that as we broach things like this, I don't want to be a fool. I don't want to just delight in airing my own opinion, but I want to delight in understanding. And usually that, goes into the old adage, I have 2 ears for a reason and 1 mouth for a reason. I need to listen more to understand. I don't understand by talking, and I just did a lot of talking. So I digressed a little bit, but I realized even that word was more triggering to people on both sides of this conversation than I even realized 3 days ago through social media.
The definition of gun control is the set of laws or policies that regulate the manufacture, sale, transfer, possession, modification, or use of firearms by civilians. So I suppose depending on where you land on that, it doesn't sound maybe as threatening. But I do think the word control it does have an amount of fear that goes along with that for people. Mm-hmm. People are afraid, and then that builds into the narrative when it becomes a politicized issue where one side's coming for your guns and one side, wants you to have all the guns, and it just becomes so hyperbolic that there's nowhere to even settle on it.
Right. So also in that, I'm just thinking this as you're talking, Eric, is gun control, it's threatening to somebody that feels threatened in this, but it also can bring, like, somebody that's on the opposite end is like using the word gun control. I feel very safe and protected by that. It is a strong word. And so I feel like somebody's going to do something about this and so, very two sides.
Let's talk a little bit about the Second Amendment. It's the right to bear arms and a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's a lot of debate you hear around this is like, well, when they wrote that, they were talking about muskets. They had to powder that and then drop the, lead ball in there. And then it took a while to get a shot off, in other words. So, now we have at least legal semi-automatic weapons that are much quicker to fire. So that, I'm sure if they knew that was coming, they would have considered it.
Yeah, I mean, the Second Amendment, anytime you get into our law, you get into sensitive areas, and Second Amendment is one of those, is the amendment really that is at war around the gun debate, for a lot of people. And I think we have to, we ask people to do this biblically when they're looking at texts, to not just take an ancient text and just use it without understanding the context and what's happening, all of that kind of stuff. And that's what thousands-year-old documents, and we believe that it's inerrant, the Bible is, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think some people come to even our amendments and the languages in our amendments with an attitude of, I'm going to use this as ammunition in one way or another.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended, honestly. But we have to, I think, realize and step back and realize the America that the Second Amendment was written in. It was a frontier kind of country where we were still states didn't exist at this time. A lot of our 50 states didn't exist at this time. And so people were moving westward in a frontier type movement, and they were also trying to get away from the tyranny, right, of another government who had
Britain.
who had controlled the US. And so they wanted to be able to have guns to protect themselves from any kind of well-regulated militia. It doesn't talk about self-defense or hunting or any of those types of things. And so I think our founding fathers realized, you know, that this is an important thing for our lives, that government can easily overthrow people, that government can have too much, you know, in the lives and influence of somebody. And so I think, you know, as crazy as our government is, you know, I think they saw original sin. They saw the fact that people that get into too much power it's not good. That's why we have 3 branches of legislation and all of those types of things. And so, but I think we have to step back and say, okay, what was the America like that this was written in, and how do we cross the cultural bridges now? Because even, for example, at that time, like so many things that were in our Declaration of Independence, a lot of the rights that we enjoy, voting, that wasn't written for everybody at that time.
Yeah.
Right. So we've had to have reformation in voting toward people that can vote. Not everybody was allowed to own a gun at that time. A lot of black people weren't allowed to own a gun at that time because of how we were looking at our country and our society. And so we've had reformation in voting. We've had reformation in a lot of things. Even for Christians, we love the Reformation because it brings us freedom from even religion. And so I think to step back and think of the context, I think most people in my conversations don't fully do that work.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times with the Second Amendment, you hear people argue that, well, yes, this was written in a time when they were fighting for their freedom from tyranny, and this will happen again. This is the argument they use, is once gun control is in place, once the citizens are unarmed, then the government will take control. And so this narrative gets spun in 1,000 different ways, and people get really riled up about it. But I mean, ultimately, you could own 50 guns, whatever, hundreds of guns. The government has F-16s. The government has nukes. The government has, they have a lot more resources than you do. Now, maybe there is this idea that I don't know. I don't have a militia that I'm a part of. Maybe you guys do. I'm not aware of any. I don't know where to even sign up. But I do think that there's almost a fantasy of people thinking, well, I'm going to be prepared to take on the government if they come to my house. And it's like, well, that's probably true, but you're also probably just going to kind of die in vain at that point, because you're not going to last very long.
I look at it on a little smaller scale.
Sure.
So conversations that I've had around the Second Amendment it's the right to bear arms. And so that's something that, even in the Bible, it's like we talk about, there's defending ourselves. There's lots of freedom. We have free will. And so a lot of people view the Second Amendment as a protection of natural rights. Like, I have instincts that if it came down to it, what would I do? I would choose self-defense, or maybe I would be passive. But I think a lot of people, when we talk about gun control, gun reform, they see that as infringing on natural rights that we have. And so I think that the government, big picture government, is part of it. But then people are thinking, well, the government isn't, on my street, that I don't necessarily feel safe on where I live. And
right. Absolutely. I think, so, I guess my point is just coming from the Second Amendment, it's written in a form of, to protect yourself from the state. And it's also, and it's one of those things where your point that you just made has been argued in very high profile court cases, where the Second Amendment has been used to, win that case and win that argument. So it's not that is an invalid thought. It's just that the Second Amendment doesn't specifically say anything about just the personal ownership of guns. It just says the people to keep and bear arms and then it references a militia. So I mean, some of that's wording that we have to interpret and continue to interpret.
Right, exactly. But then as a Christian, looking at this, I'm going to use the lens that I'm viewing the world through. And so I think that like right or wrong, we're looking at laws or things that the government is doing or the state is doing, and we're basing like our convictions on how we're interpreting this too. And I think a lot of people interpret that way. A lot of people interpret it obviously a different way.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's where it gets difficult as Christians, because we do have we're supposed to protect lives. I mean, I think that God invites us to value the lives of others, and Christ also invites us to lay down our lives for others. And so there's this tension that we get to live in on this side of a broken sin-scarred world of what does that look like? Because I think people on both sides of this issue respect life. I think both people on both sides of this issue, they don't want more people to die. And I think for one side, it's very much the answer to protect lives is to be armed, because if somebody comes somewhere and they had the opportunity to shoot, with 10 people, if there's a good guy with a gun who stops a bad guy with a gun, right, then maybe he shoots one person. That's tragic. It's a loss, but he saved that. And the other side, I think, is like, hey, because there's so many guns that are out there, guns do kill people. Like it's a fact, and there's the conversation we'll get into, maybe people kill people, but guns, like the firing of ammunition at a person leads to people's death. And so they're like, the less of that happens will preserve lives. And so I think we have to be honest and know that people on both sides of this issue, they especially Christians, I think, and most people, they believe passionately about this because they really do value life. They really do want to see less people die. This is a big deal. Lives are a big deal. Lives are at stake, and how we protect lives is, I think, where we have differences.
Right. Yeah. And and speaking of differences, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the differences in guns quickly. I think that kind of helps in the conversation. A lot of times when we're talking about gun control, at least specifically in the narrative that we hear now, it's targeted around semi-automatic rifles like an AR-15. And just to clarify, I mean, if someone is listening and doesn't really know the difference, a semi-automatic means every time you pull the trigger, a bullet exits the gun, it fires. Where fully automatic, which you're used to seeing in movies and things like that, they just hold the trigger down and it repeatedly fires automatically. That's fully automatic. But a lot of the debate right now is around those semi-automatic AR-15s. They look, I mean, to someone who isn't familiar with guns, they look scary. They look like something you'd see from a war movie or something from a gangster movie or something like that. That it's just the visual language of it speaks to people. Some would argue that those are designed for hunting, but when it comes to this debate, does that matter? Do you think that people are willing to listen to those nuances and kind of give a little, or is it just like, no, I have the right to bear arms. That's the end of it.
Are you looking at me?
We're still on air. I'm looking at you, Jess. Yeah, I'm looking at you. I feel like I just talked a lot. So
you did? Okay.
Sorry.
Do you think it matters to, I mean, even to you personally or to people do you think that those definitions matter as much as just the gun ownership itself?
I think that from the conversations I've had, changing something about guns overall in general means that there may be eventually an infringement on more. Like once we start going down this road, something that this just opens a door to more. However, I agree with what we were saying before of, this is something that was written how many years ago? I don't want to do math. 4, 7,
What?
Hundreds?
I thought you were like 4 years ago. No,
I was like, no.
The Constitution was written much longer than that.
Yeah. So long. See, I can say dumb things too, and it's
you
fine.
can. That amendment was written.
Yes,
in
that's what I was-
1789 and ratified in 1791.
Okay, so long ago, and why can't we have a conversation around it, like we talked about in headlines? Like, this is coming up where, hey, we're going to review something in this state that it's not sitting right with us. I mean, I think having the conversation, like, what's wrong with that? And I think, like, us becoming knowledgeable and not just looking at something that is very old. I don't know. I think that if you're for or against gun control, that's something that, I mean, we should be knowledgeable about. If we're going to be on the hill, like, let's.
And so much of it could go. It revolves around trust of even the government itself, and many people are very outspoken about the fact that they do not trust the government, and that they think that if you give the government an inch, they're going to take a mile. And I think in those narratives, there's valid arguments there to be had, but I also think, again, we get into these hyperbolic arguments where it's all or nothing. This is definitely going to happen, or this is never going to happen, and to me, that just doesn't help. Like, we're not going to get anywhere if everything is just all or nothing all the time, where, the left or the right, they're going to do this and that, and we paint in broad strokes. I just don't think that we really accomplish anything in those types of conversations if there isn't some nuance there. Or, even beyond gun control, but mental health, where that applies to purchasing a gun, and just how many guns are out there in general.
And I think, knowing the different classifications of guns is helpful in having a conversation with people, because there are, differences. Even if we get into a suicide conversation or whatnot, most suicides that happen with a gun are happening with a handgun. And why? Because of the size of it and availability and some of those kind of things we could get. And even like why somebody appreciates a gun, if it's a gun that is for sports, like having a conversation with that person and understanding all of this is critical. I've said, and I'll probably continue to say that, like, we all have prejudices, and proximity is our only way to get over prejudice. And so we have to have these kind of conversations in open ways, and not always assume the worst in everybody or in every modification. Like, so for an AR-15, right, though it's a semi-automatic gun and you have to pull the trigger every time, there's people that make trigger modifications that don't make it fully automatic, but that make it so you can, like, because like guns have pressure.
Bump stock.
Yeah, so guns, you can have trigger pressures. And so it takes like almost nothing on some guns to just basically a tap and it's pulling, and you can do it as fast as your finger is. And then others have modification safeties that create more of a recoil and more of a responsive nature for that to happen. And so there's some that would say, even saying, hey, no, we shouldn't like have a trigger modification conversation and not make it as close to fully automatic as we can, is 1 inch that will allow the government to take a mile. That they're only trying to change that because their ultimate outcome is that they strip me of my guns, And I think to go from A to Z, I can see how people do it, but I think it's just irresponsible to always assume that every modification or every reformed part of a conversation is just, they're out to get you. I think there is safety and what do we need and wisdom and responsibility that comes into those kinds of conversations.
I think people aren't used to having conversations like this, where maybe we can have different viewpoints, different ways that we view this issue, but have it be respectful. There is definitely trepidation that comes into a conversation. Usually, like, I'm afraid to have this conversation in the real world, like in our little like pocket that we have here of like the Uncomfortable podcast. Like, I feel safety because I feel like we are all committed to respecting and having dialogue.
Yeah.
But I think that that's really hard, Alex, what you're saying, when you don't, when it seems like even if you want to have a conversation, it's a defense and kind of you're at opposing viewpoints.
well, even knowing that I put out that we're going to have this conversation and I asked for people's feedback, I know like I'm like afraid who's going to think I'm an idiot now, because now I know their thoughts on these things. And I'm like, man, how many of my friends are going to just think I'm stupid because I don't agree with them, or like I'm just ignorant, and so even like I've been thinking, where do I stand with people? Or now that I play these cards or I talk about this, are these people going to think I'm stupid? And because I've had, even over like a biblical interpretation, whether it's women in ministry or, speaking in tongues or whatever, once you've had that conversation with people and you love and you trust, and then you do talk about your differences, I've had people just like, oh, then you don't believe the Bible because you landed somewhere different, or you hate America because you land somewhere different, and it's difficult.
Because you land in this place on this issue, I'm questioning your ability to interpret all these other things.
To parent, to
right.
whatever. Yeah. I mean, it goes, it runs deep because of the emotion in this issue.
Yeah. That's another layer. That's definitely another layer to this issue of there's fear in relationships and in families. Maybe you grew up where, everybody's got a gun and you're different and you feel differently.
Let's talk a little bit then about the two sides, or if you feel like you have to play devil's advocate a little bit, like what are some pros and cons of that? I mean, I think for me looking at this, when you talk about gun control, and I think the nightmare scenario for a lot of people who really, really love their guns are, okay, the government's going to come take my guns. And then the argument to that is there's 400 million guns in America. Who is going to round up all those guns? It's pretty much an impossible task. So even if they took all the law-abiding citizens' guns away, then there are all these guns still out on the street. There are people who don't have undocumented guns. So then that argument in itself just seems to kind of fall apart if I were to be on the side of, well, we should, as a government, we should just round up everyone's guns. Because then I think the other side of it is the person who would say, well, if you were in a scenario where there was a mass shooting, even if you don't want to carry a gun, which is fine, that's a fine choice to make if you don't feel comfortable with it, but wouldn't you rather be in a situation where the person next to you was trained carrying a concealed weapon and was able to fight back in that scenario? Then you have like this Christian pacifist point of view as well on top of that, who would say, well, if it's my time, it's my time. God cares for his children, and if I were to die in that situation, then it must have been meant to be. And so there are so many different viewpoints and so many different angles we could take on this. That could go on and on, but are there other sides to these arguments that you at least acknowledge and maybe if you don't agree with, you at least consider to be an adequate viewpoint?
I think a lot of my friends and family that are for gun control / gun reform have an absolute, their fuel is an absolute disgust for the violence that we see throughout our country. And I think for a lot of people in this camp is this is a solution. But I see a lot of people that at the heart of that is we love people, we hate violence, and they are exposing an issue that maybe wouldn't get exposed otherwise. Of like, there is an issue in this country with violence. There is an issue that does need to be addressed. I think that couples with, there's an issue with mental health. There's an issue with laws that we need to look at. And so I think that when that is the issue, for me, that's a lot of the people that I come in contact with that are from the gun control, gun reform. That's the heart of it, is we love people. This is an issue, and this is a way to fix it.
Yeah. I mean, I see validity on both sides because I see that both of them do really want the same results.
Right.
They both do really, it breaks the heart of humanity, I think, for most people that aren't like sociopaths, which are most people.
Yeah.
when people are dying, and we see that it's a problem that people are dying, not just that people are dying from violence, because I think there's different kinds of gun violence. Obviously there's gun violence toward others. There's gun violence suicidal, you know, that happens. And we see that suicide is on the rise in our country, and not just in our country. This is a worldwide epidemic. Suicide is. And so you're like, hey, if we get rid of guns, because this is a quick way, you know, as a pastor, you know, there's been moments where I've had conversations or walked into emergency room situations where someone tried to kill themselves, and thank God they didn't have access to a gun, because if they would have, when they were in that state, their life would be over. And I just see that. And I've been in pastoral situations where someone has done that. They've taken their life with a gun, and I'm like, oh, if that would have been locked up. Or I know a family that's even their kid shot themselves in the house because a gun wasn't locked up. And so from that side of things, my heart breaks, because I'm like, oh man, if these weren't around, then that wouldn't have been able to happen. But then you look at Japan, who has a lot of gun laws and gun restrictions, and they have a worse suicide problem than us. And so then you're like, well, it's not just guns that are doing this. I have a friend that's in jail for the rest of his life for murder. He didn't have a gun. He used a sword. And so, yes, it's not just, a gun that is at fault, but would it slow down? Would it give more opportunities for that person who maybe tried to OD or tried to hang themselves or tried to, whatever kinds of methods of suicide that are a little slower? Would it have given an opportunity for someone to step in if they didn't make that in a drastic decision, or had the ability to, in that state of mind, go buy a gun? And so I see that, but at the same time, I see, there is validity. Like, there are hundreds of millions of guns out there, and a lot of them not owned because they don't actually own them, but in possession by criminals. And because of where we're at as a country and how many no one's going to come pick these all up. The criminals aren't going to come on these gun amnesty days and just turn them in. I mean, that happens, but that's
a fraction of it.
It's a fraction. It's just not going to happen. And so, dealing with where we are right now and the realities of the current situation, you're not going to get all the bad guys with guns to come turn in their guns and say, sorry, we didn't mean to have this. And so we have to live in the current situation that we are as well, and what's the best way to move forward, and arming ourselves or protecting our family against this type of stuff. Me and my hanger, because I remember why I did get a gun for my family was, like, one night our alarm went off. I was just freaked out. Someone had gotten in as an adult, as a father, and our alarm went off, luckily, but I was shook because I grabbed I have a hanger. That's it. And I went down just panicked, freaking out. And, like, I had an alarm system which was helping protect. I had locks on my door, all that kind of stuff. But even those measures I had taken. So then it started getting me to think, like, what, going worst case scenario, what happens? I have a duty to protect my family, and I have the ability to get a gun and protect my family. And so for me, I was like, prayerfully made that decision that that's one of the things I needed to do. And so
when I think I'm kind of in the same boat, I never would have even thought of owning a gun until I had kids. And in that moment, I felt very defenseless. I was like, if something were to happen, will I forever regret not being able to defend my family? Well, and that kind of motivated me in a way that, I mean, some may say, well, that's selfish of you, whatever. But for me, that's what gave me that peace of mind. But then I'm reminded of a story John Piper would tell, and in relation to gun control, where he talks about these missionaries who were dealing with an indigenous tribe, and they had guns, and they were engaging with them peacefully for the most part, but then things turned, and as the story goes, as they were, having spears plunged through their hearts, they were firing their guns in the air. And, it later comes to the knowledge of people who had talked to these men before, and that their guns were not for use against, they didn't have them there to use against the natives or the people that lived there. But but more just for whatever protection from animals or whatnot. But, you know, it became clear that they fired the guns in the air because from their perspective, I already know Jesus. So if they're going to kill me, then I already know where I'm going. I know what my eternity is. But we're here for these people who don't know Jesus. And so if I'm pointing my gun at them to save myself, then they don't have a chance. At that point, they're going, you know, their eternity is sealed. And so I think, you know, for me as a believer, that story kind of hits you. And I mean, in some ways it's meant to, you know, kind of not manipulate your emotions, but it is to get you to think about that. And so I have those even kind of internal battles, like a person breaking into my house, not to just judge, but I'm guessing they probably need Jesus if they're making that decision. And like, where do you draw that? You know, and I get, and I think there's a lot of fundamental arguments that can be had there about taking another person's life and what that means, what that looks like, and the impact that has. And I think, you know, these phrases that we want to cling to, and no matter side you're on, whether it's, you know, guns don't kill people, people kill people, or if you're anti-gun, it's gun control is a public health issue. Like all these things on the surface can be true.
Yes, the answer to both of those is
yes, right. Like both of those can be true and honest, but like when we really think about it as an eternal issue, when we look at it through the lens of the church and us as Christians, like this is something that's it's much bigger than just the Western movie or the cowboys that we idolize as Americans and think, oh, well, I'm gonna, like, even as a gun owner, I don't ever think that I'm gonna win in something where I got to draw faster than the other person. Like, I mean, I know some people really pride themselves in that scenario, and some people really train in that scenario. But, you know, as a gun owner, I sometimes would think, well, maybe something's happening where I can stop someone from hurting more people than they already are. And that's kind of where it ends for me. I'm like, that I try not to at least have any delusions of being the cowboy on the white horse riding in to save the day. 'Cause I just think ultimately, Jesus said, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. It's the same thing. And maybe people are prepared for that. Maybe that's where, you know, they're living, and that's okay. But
I think even to get into that, I think for us as Christians, we have to realize the thing that made Christians different. So Jesus came and, you know, he even said, you know, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, turn the other cheek. And I don't think in that conversation, turn the other cheek, he was saying, you know, just be passive. I think it's irresponsible to totally go there with it, and people do. But even Christians, so if we get into who the first Christians were, who the first church was, what this movement was for early Christians, violence reigned in Rome. Violence was a part of the Roman rule. You know, they had, it's well documented, they had just people would get ripped to shreds by lions, and, you know, all of those kinds of things that movies, gladiators have been made out of, and killing each other was for sport.
yeah.
And then this group of peculiar people that were following Jesus, that were doing life differently, that were very passive, that weren't really wanting to, historically at that time in Rome, join the military, to take up arms, because they saw this Jesus who came and said, I'm going to change the world, not by taking over violently, but by taking over through love and through compassion. And these were people willing to lay down their lives and go into hospitals and create hospitals for those who were sick and dying, and give up their life for someone else. And this began to take traction. People began to notice, and they said, I want that. I want to give up this. And so Constantine, like he started to believe in the 300s about this power. And then they started to see, hey, this Christian religion, which was outlawed, they began to not outlaw it in that 3rd century. And then in the 3rd and 4th century, it became this Roman, you know, the Roman world became a part of that, and it adopted Christianity as their religion. And then what started to happen was Rome wanted to take more and more, you know, ownership of land, and they wanted to expand. And so they were like at this qualm of like, okay, well, we believe in this Jesus and this method of not taking over through violence. And we've got a group of people that are like, we don't want to be militant. We don't want to do all that kind of stuff. And they had to like go over the centuries, like say, all right, how do we begin to justify this and just war causes and all these kind of things happen? And so I think what made Christians different was their desire to not incite violence, to give up their life, be sacrificial for other people, to do things like you shared in that story. And so for me, as I wrestle with this, I'm like, how much control am I trying to take in this situation by owning a gun? How much right do I have to take control over somebody else's life if they break it? And I wrestle with it. Like
right.
I go back and forth, and I invite the Spirit to speak, and I listen to other people. But I just think understanding church history even tells us, man, what was different about people? I know what way culture's going. I know how we want to take over and we want to have power. But it wasn't a people driven by fear. They were actually fearless as they faced persecution, as they faced all of this. And so much of it to me feels, and even in my own life, motivated by fear.
Absolutely, yeah.
And fear is one of the greatest tactics, I think, of the enemy.
Well, and it's so emotional in this conversation because when people who are extremely pro-gun, you can hear the emotion in their voice. And they are emotionally attached to this idea of this gun is my identity. This is America's identity. This is everything I stand for. You cannot take this from me. This is my, and it's like, whoa. Like there is a bigger issue at play of the heart here that, yes, I understand that you are thinking this is the end all of everything. But I mean, we have to imagine ourselves potentially never having a gun or having our guns taken away, whatever that might look like. Like, is it worth losing, our faith or our trust in Jesus over? I don't know. But when all this stuff is fear that drives us, I don't think we're able to have that rational, even conversation with ourselves,
Yeah.
I don't think all gun control is based on fear, though. Is that what you're saying? Anybody? I think that fear could be a factor for some people, but I think even in the two stories that you shared, there's two sides. There's this part to defending yourself. There's this part to being passive, and both are valid. And to me, this conversation really comes down to personal conviction on how you're interpreting, first of all, laws, how your spiritual lens is affecting how you view the world. And I mean, even praying through an issue like this, I think that you can land on either side. And I think for me, as I'm listening to you guys talk and just processing within myself, we need to respect people's opinions and their convictions, or at least hear them. And I think that there's this ability where we can have a conversation about it, but all things we're saying are very valid based on, how we're interpreting scripture or how we're viewing the laws, or even defending yourself, Alex, is that's a biological part. Like you both said, that you didn't think about gun ownership until you had kids. That's part of our instinction. I'm a mama bear. Like my life changed when I had kids. And so I think there's all these factors that come into it. And man, when I'm having a conversation, especially when it's a mixed group of people on this issue, I want to listen, because a lot of times I've found on this issue, our opinions are based on our experiences, maybe how we were raised, situations that we were in that, altered how we view this issue. And so it's big and complicated, but I think at the end of the day, it's how am I listening and how am I respecting, and how am I loving through this and following my conviction.
Well, and I would hope that none of us come off in a way that sounds disrespectful to people
I don't
who
feel that way,
believe differently.
But
I think from what I was saying is that just so much emotion comes with this, and then that baggage can be carried on, and the way we react to things, I think it's just good for us to know where it's coming from. Why are we so protective of things that we don't really necessarily have as much control over as we like to believe. And it's something that I think we need to evaluate.
Yeah, and I think
Absolutely.
we all have the opportunity to, are we going to step in? Are we going to step into the uncomfortable? Are we going to have conversations, with people that are a part of our family that we didn't get to choose in the church, that are not, that we're called to love those people. And I think understanding and empathy is a part of loving those people. And there's just so much divisiveness, mudflinging. I mean, it's been hijacked politically on both sides of something. And so we just throw everybody into a camp and stop treating people like individuals. And so I think that's good.
It is. It's one of those things where I feel like we have so many of these conversations where we kind of get to the end of it and go,
we could keep going.
We could keep going.
We could keep going.
We didn't necessarily give an answer to it, but I do think it's one of those things where hopefully we can keep having these conversations. We can keep having these conversations with our friends, our family, our neighbors, people in the church, people we care about. And, let's, like you said, Jess, let's understand each other better and understand where everybody's coming from. But I think whenever we paint things in hyperbolic broad strokes, we have to kind of be careful of that because it doesn't really benefit anyone.
Amen.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for your time. Thanks for having this conversation, and thanks to everyone who's listening. We really appreciate that. I know these topics can be challenging at times, and I hope you're patient with us as we, walk through some of these things verbally. And sometimes we're processing these thoughts for the first time, right here for you live. So thank you. And if you have any questions or concerns and you'd like to reach out to us, you can do that on social media at CCC Omaha, or you can send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org. We'd love to hear from you. But until then, we'll talk to you next time.